Behind the lines in Flanders, close to the road and railway line that led from Poperinghe to Ypres, lies the hamlet of Brandhoek. Here, during the Great War, medical facilities were constructed to treat the wounded returning from the line. Here women faced the grim reality of the war, and today the cemeteries at Brandhoek remind us that not everybody could be saved. Aside from a brief visit to Yorkshire Trench near Poperinghe as part of our 100th episode of the Old Front Line, I realise that we haven't been back to Flanders this year yet. So in this episode we're returning to the ground around the Belgian city of Ypres, Ypres to the old contemptibles, wipers to the troops later in the war, but not on the front line, we're behind the lines. So where are we? Well, we're just outside the hamlet, the village today, of Brandhoek, which is about halfway between Poperinghe, a town behind the lines that was the main British base for much of the First World War, and the city of Ypres, and beyond that where the front lines were located. This, in 1914, was a small hamlet, Brandhoek, probably no more than 20-odd houses and a few farms, open fields around it, some woodland to the west, but to the north, and part of it straddled that, was the main Poperinghe-Ypres road, but also the main Poperinghe to Ypres railway line. And that's an important factor in the importance of this ground during those 4 years of the Great War. This was a place that never saw any fighting. The front lines were never here, but with the railway and with the roads, and with its position halfway between those two important points of Poperinghe and Ypres, we can see how Brandhoek was an important link in the arterial routes to and from the front line. Men marching up to take part in the battles or hold the line, and then the wounded or the sick coming back for treatment in medical facilities. So as such, Brandhoek, the war swept through Brandhoek for all 4 years of the conflict. It wasn't destroyed in the same way as the city of Ypres was. It was damaged by shell fire. 1 or 2 of the buildings in this area show signs of having original sections, or are themselves survivors that were rebuilt after the war. There wasn't the kind of Passchendaele-style devastation here, but it was a place that many, many soldiers who came to Flanders during the Great War would have passed through here one way or another, whether proceeding in the early years of the war by train to the front line, or later marching down the roads from Poperinghe to Ypres, or taking a motor bus, or in the back of a lorry heading up to take part in an offensive, or coming away from the trenches, as we've said. And with the flat fields surrounding this hamlet and the woods nearby, it also later on in the war became an area of important camps, because as the size of the British Expeditionary Force, including all those British and Commonwealth troops, expanded, they needed places to put them when they were out of the trenches, when they were out of the line. And around Poperinghe there were many camps, but those camps expanded beyond Poperinghe itself into places like this. In the early period of the war, in October 1914, with the German race to the sea and the movement of German forces up into northern France and Flanders, heading towards the Channel coast, the British Expeditionary Force, French units, and what was left of the Belgian army moved up into Flanders and northern France to stop that German advance. So along the ground and the roads around Brandhoek in that early period of the war, British units would have been seen marching to the front, the regular soldiers, the old contemptibles, to go off and fight in the first Battle of Ypres in October and November of 1914, but also French troops as well. And as that first Battle of Ypres came to an end, the British sector moved to the south of the city of Ypres, from the village of Saint-Éloi down in front of the Messines Ridge down towards the French border, and the French occupied the ground east of Ypres and northeast of Ypres, and this area between Ypres and Poperinghe became their rear echelon. They're behind the lines, where their lines of communication to bring up supplies, ammunition and everything else would have extended across this ground to resupply their troops in the forward zone of the battlefield. but also they would have rested their troops here, supplied their troops here, fed their troops here, and treated their wounded here as well. There's very little evidence of the French part of this today, except for the St. Charles de Pugetsi cemetery just outside of Ypres, and the odd French memorial, but here the landscape, as with much of Flanders, is dominated by the British and Commonwealth presence here during most of the war. And when the French, come the end of the Second Battle of Ypres, gradually moved out of the salient, and although they returned in other years of the war, this then became part of the British sector, and just as the French had used it as their rear echelon, the British did the same. And that whole infrastructure behind the battlefields that the British built up, that was part of their route to victory in 1918, Brandhoek was an essential link in all of that, as were many other similar hamlets in this area. During that period of the Second Battle of Ypres in April and May of 1915, field ambulances of different British divisions that were in the front line trying to stop the German advance in that first use of poison gas used the flat fields around Brandhoek and some of the farm buildings to establish field ambulances here and create advanced dressing stations and main dressing stations for the wounded. Now, we've discussed the whole way medical evacuation worked within the British and Commonwealth forces in the Great War, but it's worth reminding ourselves of that. In the frontline area, each individual unit would have had its own medical officer, and he'd have had stretcher bearers and medical orderlies working with him, and they would have been the first port of call for the wounded on the battlefields. The stretcher bearers picking them up, bringing them to a regimental aid post, an RAP, the medical officer or the regimental medical officer, so an MO, an RMO, they would have then ascertained which soldiers had a chance of survival, treated those wounds as a priority, done what they could for the men who were clearly not going to survive their wounds, and then the stretcher bearers would have handed over the wounded to personnel from a field ambulance in the Royal Army Medical Corps, one of the field ambulances within their division, who would have brought them back to an advanced dressing station or a main dressing station, an ADS or an MDS, such as was established here at Brandhoek during that period. And at an ADS or an MDS, the soldiers would have had their wounds cleaned and redressed, and the RAMC medical officers working in those dressing stations would have then reassessed the wounded soldiers and again reassess their chances of survival to the next medical facility, which in this case would be a casualty clearing station. And then the wounded would be moved from here by horse-drawn ambulance or motor ambulance back to one of those CCSs, casualty clearing stations, which were much further behind the lines. They covered a square mile of ground, and there were proper surgeons, there were nurses there too, and a large number of medical orderlies who could properly treat the wounded in what was essentially an advanced field hospital. And after treatment at the CCS, if they required any further treatment, some men were treated at the CCS, patched up, recuperated, and sent back to their battalions in the field. But if they, as was particularly during the times of big offensives, they would require further treatment, if that was the case, they would be sent back, often by ambulance train, to a base hospital on the coast, somewhere near Boulogne or Calais or further down towards Rouen on the Normandy coast there, where there were a large number of military hospitals. And we looked at that in a previous episode of the podcast called The Crimson Coast, and you'll find that if you go back through the podcast catalogue. So for the remainder of 1915, with the end of the Second Battle of Ypres and the establishment of the front line, the so-called salient around Ypres, which was that curvature of lines of trenches that moved and followed the high ground in a semicircle with Ypres at its epicentre, and that was that long period of trench warfare from mid-1915 to mid-1917 with no major battles on the scale of the gas attack or Passchendaele, but lots of units rotating through here and obviously suffering casualties. And Brandhoek fitted into that in its position as a medical evacuation route for the wounded. So it stayed as an ADS, advanced dressing station, and a main dressing station during that period, and then units holding the line outside of Ypres would bring their wounded back to here. And in June of 1916, the Canadians, the 3rd Canadian Division, recently arrived on the Western Front, up in the front line near Hill 62 and Sanctuary Wood and close to the Menin Road and Observatory Ridge, came under attack from the Germans, and a lot of their wounded from that period were brought back through here and treated in dressing stations in this sector, which were then manned by units of the Canadian Army Medical Corps. So it wasn't just British medical units that were here. As the war moved on, units from the Commonwealth, the then Empire nations, were very much part of the story in places like this. By the time of the Battle of Messines in June of 1917, this was still a dressing station area, and it was part of the designated route for the treatment of wounded for that offensive. And there's a very good map in the medical official histories that shows just how that operated, and I'll put that on the podcast website. And when we look at that map, we can see that the wounded in the sectors from Hooge across to Observatory Ridge, the Bluff and Saint-Éloi, so the northern part of the Messines sector, were brought back for treatment from the frontline areas to places like Zillebeek and Railway Dugouts, Advanced Dressing Station, Woodcote Farm, and then down either through Ypres or via other locations to the main dressing station at Brandhoek, where there was a railway siding where men could be evacuated back to places like Remy Siding, which is where Lissenherk Cemetery is, where there were casualty clearing stations there, or Mendingham, which was another one of the main areas for casualty reception. There was that famous collection of little hamlets there, Bandageham, Mendingham and Dosingham, kind of a play on what medical personnel did to soldiers, bandaging them, mending them and dosing them up with painkillers to relieve the pain. And it was the establishment of the ambulance train facilities that were here that gave Brandhoek then its greater importance, because the railway between Poperinghe and Ypres had not been used since 1915. With the German occupation of the high ground around the city of Ypres, trying to run trains from Poperinghe into Ypres was impossible. So the line had been discontinued. It was still there, but as the offensive moved on with the commencement of the Battle of Messines and later Passchendaele, they decided it was safe again to bring trains, not as far as Ypres, but certainly here to Brandhoek, to not bring up supplies or troops, but to evacuate the wounded. So ambulance trains with medical officers on board, with nurses on board and medical personnel to bring the wounded back to the casualty clearing station so they could be safely and quickly transported, and so their chances of survival were much greater, were then used from this point. And that's when we see a transition of Brandhoek being for field ambulances to have dressing stations, to casualty clearing stations then being moved forward in anticipation of the next big offensive. It wasn't done for Messines in June, but it was decided to do that for the Third Battle of Ypres for July of 1917. So 2 British and 1 Australian casualty clearing station were moved into Brandhoek, and they set up there. Now there were risks in this, and we'll come back to that, because being nearer to the front, it meant that you were exposed to shell fire in a way that if you were further back, you weren't. But the idea was to try and save as many lives as possible. And one of the key factors in that, and this is a time, of course, when there are no antibiotics to try and stem infection, for example, with men coming in with terrible wounds that could easily get infected by bacteria in the soil or bacteria in clothing being drawn into the wound when a soldier was struck by a bullet or a fragment of a shell or a shrapnel ball. One of the key factors in survival was how quickly you could get them to the best medical facilities as possible. So moving the casualty clearing stations forward nearer to the battle area meant that there was a greater chance of those soldiers surviving, and from the Army's point of view, surviving, recovering from their wounds and returning at some point to their unit. And another factor that Brandhoek reflects is the changing way in which the medical services decided to deal with wounds. In the early period of the war, a field ambulance or a casualty clearing station would deal with every type of wound possible, from bayonets to gas, as the war progressed. But they realised that if you had specialist casualty clearing stations, or groups of them, that dealt with specific wounds, and therefore personnel, medical officers and surgeons within those casualty clearing stations that were specialists in given fields, then again the chances of a soldier's survival of his wounds were much higher. So at Brandhoek they decided to use those for abdominal wounds, for severe chest injuries and also for the compound fractures of the thigh. Now, that meant there were probably within these three CCSs men who were experts in those given fields. So abdominal wounds from shrapnel or bullets, which were very difficult to treat, chest injuries where a soldier has been struck in the chest by shrapnel or perhaps riddled with bullets, or even crush injuries to the chest where a soldier has been in a trench or a dugout that's been hit by a shell fire and he's been crushed by the weight of soil or timber or whatever it is that's fallen on him. And the thigh injuries are common in attacks because as men move forward, the machine gun bullets of the enemy machine guns are firing at that level of their body. The bullets strike their thighs, cause injuries to that area of the body. And again, if you have doctors who are here that are experts, specialists in those fields, then the men being brought in with those categories of wounds, which were ones that could very easily result in death, then you gave these men a much greater chance. So what we see is, as with many aspects of the Great War, is that things did not stand still. Developments not just in technology and weapons and tactics and the approach to war, but the treatment of wounded and the treatment of wounds changed as well, and it led to many developments that went on into civilian life way beyond the war and still echo down the century beyond 1918, even today. But you'll remember, with moving these casualty clearing stations forward closer to the battle area, there was that risk, and that risk came to a head here on the 21st of August 1917. Now this is 3 weeks into the Third Battle of Ypres. The line has moved forward outside of the city of Ypres, but this area is still within the range of German guns, particularly heavy artillery, and the Germans, using a mixture of observation from balloons or aircraft, can see what's going on here, and the trains would have stood out, the ambulance trains, and they, although they would have had a red cross painted on them, and I don't believe that the Germans were deliberately targeting medical facilities, but they probably reckoned that if there was a train evacuating wounded, there were probably trains bringing up shells, small arms ammunition, grenades, trench mortars and everything else. So they shelled this area on the 21st of August 1917, and essentially all three casualty clearing stations were, and this is the phrase used in the medical official history, were shelled out. They were unusable because of the shell fire. The patients were evacuated by ambulance train, so the trains were at the station, the siding that was placed here at Brandhoek, ready to go. The medical officers, the medical orderlies and the nurses, and this is another thing to remember, is that during the 4 years of the Great War, this is the nearest point that women got to the battlefield here in Flanders. This was the tip of the spear of the use of women in the Great War in that nursing role to treat the wounded. And it put everybody at risk, the medical staff and the nursing staff as well. And when the shells began to drop, they were out there at the sidings, loading the wounded up, getting them onto the ambulance trains and getting them away back to the casualty clearing stations, back beyond Poperinghe as quickly as possible to minimise casualties. Now, some men were hit as they were being loaded up or were waiting at the siding for evacuation, and one nurse was killed, Nellie Spindler. Now, we've discussed Nellie in a previous episode when we visited Lissenherk Cemetery, where she is buried. She was from Yorkshire. Her father was a police officer. She was a professional nurse who had entered the Imperial Nursing Service and come over to do her bit to treat the wounded. And she was killed. Several other nurses were decorated for their bravery, for their gallantry in evacuating the wounded. And the War Office, seeing a woman killed, and Nellie Spindler was the only woman killed on Belgian soil serving with the British and Commonwealth forces in the Great War, one of only 2 women buried on Belgian soil who died in the Great War. The other one died of influenza in 1919. But what is often forgotten, and something we'll look at, and I'm promising another podcast here, is there was actually another nurse killed in Flanders, but across the border in what was technically French soil in French Flanders, but it was part of the operations for the Third Battle of Ypres in 1917. But Nellie Spindler's death resulted in nurses being moved much further back, away from harm, essentially, because the War Office was always worried about the death of women on the battlefield. They thought that if women were seen to be killed at the front, this would have a negative effect on public opinion and how they regarded the war, so they were moved to places that the army felt were safe. But of course, by 1917-18, with the advent of Gotha bombers, the German aircraft that come across to England and bomb, they used the same aircraft to bomb areas behind the lines, so nowhere really was safe, and women were killed at Ypres in that final year of the war. And again, if you go back to our episode on Ypres Military Cemetery as part of the Crimson Coast, we talk about that there. So following the shelling out of these casualty clearing stations in August 1917, 2 of them were moved back to the other side of Poperinghe. Number 32 casualty clearing station stayed here for walking cases only, and that meant wounded that were capable of moving on their own 2 feet, that they were not so badly wounded that they needed stretchers or ambulances to move them around, and they could more quickly be processed through this ground and not necessarily need an ambulance train to move them back. But during that period that the casualty clearing stations were here, in the lead up to in the first phase of the Third Battle of Ypres, how many men had they been treating? And these figures give us an insight into how important a role these medical units had. So number 32 casualty clearing station treated 5,349 casualties, of which they operated on 1,253, because casualty clearing stations were not just a medical treatment area where they patched men up and moved them on. There were operating theatres, there were blood transfusion facilities there, and there was X-ray as well. So it was a proper medical surgical unit. So number 32 CCS, over 5,300. Number 3 Australian casualty clearing station that worked alongside them, they treated 7,073, of which over 2,100 required operations. And number 44 casualty clearing station, which Nellie Spindler had worked with, treated 8,234 casualties, of which 2,377 required operations. So that's a fair number of casualties coming in from the front line in those first few weeks of the Third Battle of Ypres. But because of that shelling, the casualty clearing stations never returned to Brandhoek. They stayed in that area beyond and around Poperinghe. But medical units, field ambulances, did return to Brandhoek in the fighting during the Battle of Lys in April 1918, and then in the 4th and final Battle of Ypres in September and October of that year, as the lines around Ypres were finally broken and the German army pushed back, leading to the end of the war in November 1918. There were camps here, of course, and that was an important aspect of it as well, close to some of the medical facilities, which probably added to their target value in terms of German shelling. There were military camps where soldiers were resting, training, and there were depots for stores and supplies. And this whole landscape would have been very much a military landscape, something that you see if you look at aerial photographs of this. And on Chris Baker's Long Trail website, he has a little section on Brandhoek on there, and he has some of those aerial photographs on that. And I'll put a link to this on the podcast website so you can see it. But I hope what this does once more, and I've done this a lot in previous podcasts, is just stress the importance of these behind-the-lines locations. It's not all about the bullets and the bayonets and the bombs in the front line. What happened behind the front is just as important. So we're going to go on a walk now to see what remains of the Great War here in the hamlet, the village of Brandhoek. We're starting west of the village of Brandhoek, southwest in fact, close to one of the cemeteries, one of 3 cemeteries that we'll see on this walk. And I'll put a map from Google Maps onto the website so you can follow the progress of where we are. We're standing outside the entrance of Brandhoek New Military Cemetery number 3. This cemetery opened in August of 1917, a few weeks before that shelling that closed the casualty clearing stations, and it was used during that period to bury the dead, men who had died of their wounds. Now, the medical facilities were good, and having facilities that specialised in certain types of wounds did increase the chances of survival, but not every soldier could be saved. And when they died of their wounds, they were brought to the cemetery here to be buried in the presence of army chaplains, personnel from the casualty clearing station, and if the soldiers' unit was close by, sometimes they came along to the funeral as well. It just depended on the circumstances of where the soldiers' comrades were. But what it meant compared to battlefield burials, men buried actually in the ground where the fighting took place, is that these were not lonely burials. They were burials in which there was often quite a lot of personnel there, and they were properly prepared burials as well. Very often they would dig trenches and bury the dead in those, and it's quite likely that some, if not all, of these men buried in the 3 cemeteries that we're going to were buried, particularly in this cemetery and the next one, were buried in some kind of makeshift coffin. Not as decorative or ornate as you'd find in civilian life, but a wooden box that the soldier would be placed in and buried in the grounds. Or they were wrapped up in sandbag-style material, Hessian material. And when we look at contemporary archive film and photographs of the burial of the dead, we see that being done quite commonly at different points during the conflict. The cemetery remained in use until 1918, although the casualty clearing stations had moved away. You remember the field ambulances came back here and they buried some of their dead, but there were a lot of gun sites around Brandhoek as well. So as the front moved forward, the field artillery units that may have had their guns protecting the positions around Ypres and enabling the offensives to move forward with those early bombardments, they then moved further forward themselves, and some of the heavier guns moved into this area. So raw field artillery moved out, raw garrison artillery with 6-inch guns or above moved in, and they fired their weapons from here. Now both sides were always targeting artillery positions, and the gunners, which the infantry often unfairly called 1,000-mile snipers, trying to imply that they somehow had a cushier war and suffered fewer casualties. In fact, when gun sites came under fire and there's lots of high explosive shells lying around and they get hit, then often casualties can be quite high. And we see that reflected in cemeteries that were close to the site of gun positions, this being one of them. So when you wander around the rows here, you will see the cap badge of the Royal Artillery quite frequently. In total, there's 849 British graves, 46 Australian, 46 Canadian, 18 New Zealanders, 5 South Africans, 1 soldier from the British West Indies Regiment, and 1 soldier from the Chinese Labour Corps. Like all 3 cemeteries on this walk, they're all designed by one Imperial War Graves Commission architect, Sir Reginald Bloomfield. So these are 3 Bloomfield cemeteries, and their entranceways are almost identical and certainly very, very similar. So we can see the impact that he had on the design of these permanent cemetery sites here at Brandhoek. Now, standing outside the entrance, the shelter entrance to this cemetery, there's an unusual feature. There's a bronze gate in front of us. Now, a bronze gate in itself is not unusual. Many cemeteries have this, but this one was given by the family of an officer who is buried in here. It was given by the family of Lieutenant Anthony Herbert Strutt of the 16th Battalion Notts and Derby Regiment, the Sherwood Foresters. He was the son of George Strutt, who was JP for Derbyshire. He was educated at Harrow and Trinity College, Cambridge, and at the outbreak of war joined the Inns of Court Officer Training Corps, which was a territorial unit that was used as an officer training unit to supply men to regiments and corps of the British Army. And he was then commissioned into the Sherwood Foresters and sent to their 16th Battalion, which was a Bantam battalion. We mentioned them in the previous podcast about Bull on Wood, and he served with them on the Somme. And at the end of the Somme campaign, as that cold winter crept in, he was evacuated from the front line that December with trench fever. He didn't return to the Western Front until October 1917 at the tail end of the Third Battle of Ypres, and served in Flanders. And during the German offensives of March and April 1918, his battalion was heavily involved in that. He was gassed at one point during the Battle of the Lys, and then he was fatally wounded by a shell near Wormerzeele, which is not that far away and was then the front line area, and died of his wounds on the 27th of April 1918. Now, he's memorialised in many places in Britain, and here with these gates. And this is an unusual feature, because you might ask yourself, why didn't every family donate gates? How they got permission to do this, I don't entirely know. Perhaps something exists in the archives of the Imperial War Graves Commission to explain this, because if I think it had been common knowledge that you could have done this, lots of other families probably would have stepped forward and have done the same. That desire to memorialise those who fell just grew and grew, and those with money, and his father obviously was a wealthy man, had the ability to do that by placing memorials in churches, on graves, giving money towards bigger projects like war memorials, and here by installing some bronze gates. So it's interesting to see how families almost became obsessed with this memorialisation. It was their way of dealing with the grief. There was never closure for them under any circumstances, I don't think. But the attempt to memorialise, the desire to memorialise, I'm sure somehow helped them with their grief. And it's their legacy, really, that legacy of grief that we see in so many places connected to the Great War. As we go into the cemetery, we can see that the headstones are very close together, and it's pretty much in date order, and it reflects that establishment of trenches here where they buried men as they died of wounds in the casualty clearing stations. And one of the graves that I come to when I visit this cemetery, because it connects me to the Somme as well, is that of Lieutenant Colonel Stafford James Somerville. He was the commanding officer of the 9th Royal Irish Fusiliers, who died of his wounds on the 16th of August 1917, aged 46. His battalion had been involved in the crossing of the Steenbeek on that day. He was educated at Wellington College and at Sandhurst. He was a regular soldier, and his father was a chaplain to the forces. He'd previously served in both Gallipoli and at Salonika, but what connects me to the Somme via him is not his own service, but his eldest son. Stafford Dudley Somerville was an officer of the King's Own Yorkshire Line Infantry that was attached to an Irish regiment and was killed on the Somme on the 5th of July 1916 and buried in Auteuil Military Cemetery. And again, that's a cemetery that we've covered in a previous episode of the podcast. So what we see with the father buried here in Flanders and the son buried on the Somme is one of those tragic cases of father and son being killed in the Great War. And I wish I could say that this was a unique occurrence with the Somervilles, but it isn't. There were sadly father and son serving in the same unit, killed on the same day, for example. So how does a mother, how does a wife, how does a woman deal with that? She's not lost just one part of her world, she's lost two parts of it. And the weight of grief under those circumstances is almost impossible, I think, for us to imagine. And as I've said a few times on this podcast and indeed elsewhere, for me, the women of the Great War who were left with this legacy of grief, who were left with this necessity to deal with the outcome of the deaths of men here on the battlefields, their lives had come to an end. But for these women, they had to deal with that for the rest of their natural life. And it's something that would never go away. So for me, they are as much victims of the Great War as the men they were mourning. And we see in the eloquent writing of a middle-class woman like Vera Brittain, she's able to verbalise that grief, quantify it. And you read Testament of Youth and see how the loss of her fiancé, of her fiancé's friends, of her brother, completely devastated her. And in that she speaks, no doubt, for so many. And it's something that is always worth thinking about when you stand at these graves. The echoes beyond the front line, how it affected those back home, how it changed their lives forever. Now, this being a casualty clearing station cemetery, where men were brought in wounded, often conscious when they were first brought in, and in their pockets were their pay books, round their neck were their dog tags and other papers on them to prove who they were, the number of unknown burials in cemeteries like this are often either non-existent completely, there are none of them, or they're very few indeed. And there's one that I came across in here many years ago of an unknown officer of an Irish regiment where it had a date of death on there, because although they might not know who he was, they could see what regimental insignia he had on, and they knew which day he died, because that was the day that he was brought in and he died of his wounds. They could at least put that on the cross. And the date was the 16th of August 1917, that same date as Lieutenant Colonel Somerville. That was when Irish regiments had fought in the Battle of the Steenbeek. And I often wondered how and why couldn't they identify this officer. When you look at the records, there are several missing officers on that date. It was a battle in the swampy, muddy ground of Passchendaele of Third Ypres, so it wasn't uncommon for soldiers to be missing under those circumstances. And there are quite a few names to look at, but one of them is listed as having died of his wounds. Whether that is him here or not, I don't know, but it prompts that thought in your mind. What led to an officer being brought in from the battlefield? An officer's kit belonged to them. They'd purchased it, so it had their name in it. It had their details in it. They would have had cigarette cases, they would have had personal items, they would have had probably ornate identity discs. But there's nothing for this man bar his regiment and the day that he died. What had happened to him? What kind of wound had he sustained that he was unidentifiable? And I think when you stand there and you look at that grave and you think about that, the sheer horror of the Great War really comes into sharp focus at just a simple thing like the grave of an unknown soldier. Perhaps he'll never be identified, but there have been quite a few cases in recent years of researchers providing enough information, enough research to prove the identity of a previously unknown soldier, and for the Commission, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission as they are today, to change the headstone. Maybe one day that'll happen here. But whoever he is, of course, he is commemorated. His name will be on the Menin Gate or the Tyne Cot Memorial. Most likely Tyne Cot. The 16th of August 1917 was the cut-off date between those two monuments. But you do see some men erroneously commemorated on the Menin Gate when they should be on Tyne Cot, and vice versa. But whatever, he's commemorated somewhere, and perhaps the identification of this man indicating perhaps the horror of his death is something to be left alone. But that's not for me to decide. So leaving the cemetery, we'll walk back out onto the road through those ornate gates, and we'll shut them thinking of that officer they commemorate, turn right and walk a little bit further down the road towards some more modern buildings in this part of Brandhoek, and then there's a Commonwealth War Graves Commission sign indicating a little grass path that we walk down to visit our next cemetery. The second of the cemeteries that we'll see on this walk is Brandhoek New Military Cemetery. This is probably the most visited of the three that are here for reasons that will become apparent shortly. But burials on this site started in July 1917 in the lead up to the Third Battle of Ypres, and it was used by the casualty clearing stations that then opened at this location, but it was closed in August 1917 after the shelling. Even in that short period, with all those thousands of wounded soldiers coming in, and you remember the figures that we had for the casualty clearing stations that operated here, the number of burials indicate just how fatal some of the wounds soldiers had when they were brought into these places. So there are 513 British soldiers here, 28 Germans, 11 Australians and 6 Canadians. Now 28 Germans, why is that? Well, wounded German soldiers in any offensive were brought in. They were captured in the forward zone of the battlefield, in trenches, dugouts, shell holes, wherever it was, and the stretcher bearers and medical personnel would treat them decently and would do as much as they could for them, because the Germans did the same with British and Commonwealth wounded and with French wounded as well, and the French did the same with German wounded on their part of the front. So there was this kind of reciprocal agreement to treat the wounded properly as much as possible. So German soldiers would have been brought down the evacuation chain with British wounded, brought to the casualty clearing stations here at Brandhoek and treated. And generally what they would do is they wouldn't put a German soldier in a bed alongside a British Tommy. Now you've got to remember, I think we've discussed this before, is that British soldiers were trained to fight and kill the enemy. That was their duty. That was what they were there for. This wasn't a picnic, the Great War. They were soldiers, and the end result of fighting was attacking, shooting, killing, potentially, an enemy. And I suspect that if you'd been in an attack and seen some of your mates get killed, the last thing you wanted to do was to wake up in a bed alongside a wounded Fritz. And then on the other side of no man's land, they would have felt the same. There was a veteran that I interviewed who was wounded in the Battle of Lys in April 1918. He was a gunner in the Royal Field Artillery. A shell struck his field gun, killed all of the crew except him, badly wounded him, which led to the amputation of one of his legs. And he woke up in a German dressing station in a church somewhere behind their lines. And the medical orderlies and some of the soldiers going past him, every time they went by, they would stop and kick his stump and say, "Schweine Engländer." And so you can see that, combat soldiers of both sides would not want to be treated necessarily alongside the enemy. So what they would generally do with German wounded in places like this is have a separate part of a ward, or even a separate ward for those German wounded soldiers. Treat them just as well, treat them with just as much dignity, and give them the same chances of survival. And when they died of their wounds, as many of them would have done, they were brought for burial in British cemeteries. Now, in some cases, those graves were removed after the war to be taken to German cemeteries, but in some cases they weren't. So when we go to cemeteries like this behind the lines, and pretty much all of the British cemeteries between Ypres and Poperinghe and around Poperinghe where they were close to casualty clearing stations or medical units, there are German burials, men who died in the medical facility and were buried in a British cemetery, so it's not an uncommon thing. And once upon a time there would have been German cemeteries in Flanders where there would have been British graves. Now in most cases those would have been removed in the 20s and brought to cemeteries like Polkapelle or Tyne-Cot. There's quite a few from German cemeteries in both of those locations. But we know, and again if you go back to a previous podcast episode about Langemark German cemetery, there were British soldiers moved into there when the German cemeteries in Flanders were closed in the 50s, and they were moved into the Kameradengraben, the mass graves. But the reason people come to visit this cemetery in such great numbers is not because of the unusual proportion of German soldiers buried here, it's because of a single headstone very close to the cross of sacrifice. And that's the grave of Captain Noel Godfrey Chavasse, Victoria Cross and Bar Military Cross, VC and Bar MC. Now Chavasse was one of the most decorated soldiers of the Great War, one of only 3 men to be awarded the Victoria Cross twice, 2 of them being medical officers, Chavasse and Arthur Martin Leake, and the third one in the Second World War, Charles Upham, a New Zealand infantry officer who was awarded the Victoria Cross twice for bravery in Crete and North Africa. So Chavasse is an interesting character who we've mentioned many times on this podcast, but just to refresh our memory of him, he was the son of the Bishop of Liverpool. He was one of a pair of twins. His brother Christopher was an army chaplain in the Great War and survived. A third brother was an officer in the King's Liverpool Regiment and was killed in July 1917, and his name is on the Menin Gate. There were twin sisters as well who became VADs, part of the Voluntary Aid Detachment, and I met them in the 1980s at the Imperial War Museum when they came to present a lot of the family archive to the IWM collection. The Chavasses were an amazing family, and Noel Chavasse, a medical student, then doctor, then regimental medical officer of the 10th Battalion of the King's Liverpool Regiment, the Liverpool Scottish, was a pre-war territorial force, part-time Saturday night soldier with that unit. When the unit was mobilised in 1914, it had a high number of men who'd agreed to imperial service, overseas service, so it was one of those early territorial battalions that was dispatched to the front in November 1914, and he came over with them. He was awarded the Military Cross for bravery as the medical officer at Hooge in June 1915 up on the Bellewaerde Ridge. His first Victoria Cross at Guillemont on the Somme when he advanced right across the open ground between Trones Wood and the edge of Guillemont and was picking up the wounded only yards from the German trenches. He got the Victoria Cross for that action, and then his bar to the Victoria Cross was awarded for his bravery in the opening days of the Third Battle of Ypres, when he went out to recover the wounded, knowing that out there on the battlefield as the rain fell and the shell holes were filling up with water, if he didn't do as much as possible, then the men might drown in those shell holes if they had wounds that had incapacitated them, stopped them from crawling away or getting away from that. So he went out tirelessly trying to recover the wounded, and was hit by a shell blast, dying of his wounds here at Brandhoek on the 4th of August 1917. Chavasse had had the opportunity to work in a CCS like the ones here or in a base hospital. Given the fact that he'd been awarded the Victoria Cross, he was a very well-known medical officer. He could have easily have taken that cushy job, but he felt that his duty was with his battalion, and he stayed with that battalion. And he is the most famous medical officer of the Great War, really. And people come here to visit, understandably come here to visit his grave. Many just walk in, see his grave, walk out again. They don't walk round the wider cemetery, which I always think is a bit of a shame, because Chavasse is the well-known medical officer, but there are 2 other medical officers buried here. And the role of the RMO, the MO, the regimental medical officer, that was such an important one in the Great War, because his job was to try and save the lives of men on the battlefield when the fighting took place, and in quiet sectors see to their injuries, their wounds and their sickness. And they got to know men within the battalion. The men trusted their medical officer if he was a good one, and their role in trying to save their lives with the stretcher bearers that worked alongside them was such an important one, but a dangerous one too. And the number of medical officers who died in the Great War, it's just simply staggering. everywhere you go across the Western Front in these cemeteries, you will find medical officers who were killed out there on the battlefield in the midst of shot and shell, bolt upright often, trying to get out there to find the wounded. They were prime targets, and many of them were hit. The Germans were not deliberately targeting them, but very often at some great distance, even if they had a white brassard and armband with a red cross on it, it would be almost impossible to see it. And so their diligence, their devotion to what they did so often cost them their lives. And the ones that survived, who in those battlefield situations had to really play God almost to treat the wounded, assess the wounded, and decide which ones would live and which ones would sadly die, that played on their minds forever. And I remember reading some research that indicated that the suicide rate amongst former medical officers was unusually high after the Great War, and I guess that eventually all of this caught up with some of them. So it's right to come here, and when we look at his headstone, it's a brand new, it's a modern headstone with 2 Victoria Cross symbols on it. When I first came here with my school in 1982, our teachers brought us here to see this grave for the same reasons that everyone else comes here. It was the original headstone that had a single Victoria Cross on it, as was the standard practice for recipients of the VC. Then a decision was made, I think in the late 80s, early 90s, to change the headstone to what we see today. But people come here and they focus on Chavasse. But if you come here yourself, rightly visit him, remember him. He was an incredible man that saved so many lives. But he's just one part of the jigsaw. He's just one medical officer in so many. And it's time, I think, to remember them, rightly remember them all. And while we scan our eyes across the graves that surround Chavasse and we see other men from his 55th West Lancashire Division, but also quite a lot of Irish graves from the fighting in the early phase of 3rd Ypres, we do see more Royal Army Medical Corps RAMC graves, including a row of 3 men from the 47th Sanitary Section. They died on the 5th of August 1917. Now, a sanitary section's job was to look after the sanitary arrangements for soldiers on a battlefield or behind a battlefield. And of course we're talking about toilets here, and when we did the podcast on food, we mentioned that what goes in must come out, and sanitary sections were really important units in the health and well-being of troops on a battlefield. Without proper toilets, disease would be everywhere. And while we all like to snigger at a few lavatorial jokes, the reality was that on a battlefield area, the provision of toilets for soldiers was so important. And the role that these sanitary section men had was just as important as any other medical role of the Great War. So we'll go back out through the shelter entrance, close the gate behind us, go back onto the grass path. Having come here so many times over the years and bumped into people who were coming for the same reason to come and visit Chavasse, it's always interesting to stop and talk to fellow battlefield visitors. It's one of the things I like about our podcast community that we're building up and the podcast supporters chats that we have, to hear your side of the story. And I've always been fascinated when I've been out on the ground to find out why people are there. And I've met so many at Chavasse's grave or in the approach to the cemetery who've then talked about their own family members, people who were connected to Chavasse's twin brother, had been married by him, for example, and wanted to come and pay their respects to the twin of the man who had married them in Rochester Cathedral, which is one of the places where he worked many years after the Great War. And then others who are just wandering around the battlefield and curious to see what these cemeteries are. The main fast road now between Ypres and Poperinghe runs very close to this cemetery, and anyone driving down that road who suddenly saw a small British cemetery in the fields would understandably want to come and see what that was all about. But it is those conversations that we have when we walk the battlefields and meet those others who are on the same wavelength of the Great War as we are. It's part of that special experience of coming to these places, something that I know we've all missed over these last 2 years. So following the grass path back to the road, we'll turn left, we'll walk down the road. If we look at some of the buildings in this street, they are buildings that were here at the time of the Great War. They can be very modern looking in some respects because the Belgians are very good at looking after their properties and they keep them in such a beautiful way, and they perhaps don't look as old as some of them are, but they're definitely buildings that were here at the time of the Great War. And that brings us out onto a road junction where straight ahead of us is the third and final cemetery that we'll see on this walk. This is the original Brandhoek burial ground. It's Brandhoek Military Cemetery, and the largest of the three that we've seen on this walk. This began when the field ambulances of the Royal Army Medical Corps that established advanced dressing stations and main dressing stations here from 1915 onwards buried their dead. Again, in their medical facilities, sadly some soldiers just didn't make it. And while a dressing station was not as permanent a feature as a casualty clearing station perhaps was, nevertheless they needed military cemeteries close by to bury their dead, and that's how this burial ground began. Because it was close to the main arterial routes going to and from the trenches, it would be a cemetery that was seen by many soldiers going up to the line or returning from it. And what you also find with this cemetery is men who were killed in the frontline areas being brought back for burial here. That wasn't an uncommon thing. Soldiers knew that if you buried men on a battlefield, shell fire could destroy their burial site. And if it was a particularly beloved soldier or officer, it wasn't uncommon for their body to be brought back to a place like this for a proper burial. And very often, I remember talking to one veteran who buried his company commander in a cemetery, and as they'd marched past it quite a few times subsequently, they would always tip their helmets towards the boss, towards the officer that had got him through so many situations on the front line, but sadly his luck had run out, but the men never forgot him. The first burials were made here in May of 1915, and they continued in the lead up to the Third Battle of Ypres in July of 1917. Then this cemetery was closed and the other two were open for burials when the casualty clearing stations came here. There are 600 British burials in this cemetery, 63 Canadian, 4 Australian, 2 men from the Bermuda Rifle Corps and 2 German soldiers. There's only 4 unknown soldiers amongst them. The graves are in date order, which by walking through you can pick up signs of activity on the front line, as there are lots of men from a particular date buried close together. It indicates that the unit had been perhaps heavily shelled during a quiet period, or a trench raid or minor operation had taken place somewhere on the front line near to Ypres. Again, we see quite a lot of gunners in here, men from the Royal Field Artillery and the Royal Garrison Artillery. More from the Field Artillery in this case, because when this cemetery was open for the bulk of its period that burials were made here, the Field Artillery positions, the Army Field Artillery brigades and the Divisional Artillery had gun pits close to this area between here and Vlamertinge. And particularly in that period around 1917 with the Battle of Messines and Third Ypres, the Germans put a lot of effort into targeting these artillery locations and trying to destroy them. A huge number of artillery units were brought up, and it was probably often very difficult to entirely disguise the fact that they were there, so they too became targets on the battlefield, and you see that reflected in the burials that are here. There's a senior officer grave in this cemetery, Brigadier General Frederick James Hayworth, CBDSO. He was the commanding officer of the 3rd Guards Brigade, part of the Guards Division. He'd been born in 1863 and served in some of those Victorian wars in the Sudan and the Boer War, and came out with his old regiment, the Scots Guards, in November 1914, and was almost immediately promoted to a brigade commander within the 7th Division during the First Battle of Ypres, and then later transferred to the 3rd Guards Brigade when the Guards Division was formed. He was killed on the 9th of May 1916, so not a big battle. This was during a quiet period on the front line around Ypres, and his brigade was holding the trenches just on the other side of the Ypres Canal, close to the village of Poperinghe, on that forgotten battlefield that the diggers had worked on all those years ago as part of that early phase of battlefield archaeology. He'd been shot by a German sniper when he was touring the front line, and again as a brigadier general in 1916, he could have easily have just been in a chateau behind the lines in a place like Elverdinge, for example, but he chose not to. He chose to be in the front line, to see what his men were doing, to observe the trenches that they held, see the landscape of no man's land in the German positions, and in doing so, he put himself at risk. So it's something that we do mention a lot on the podcast because it's an important part of our understanding of the Great War. We've all seen Blackadder and General Melchett. The reality is that chateau generals really were rare, and these men led by example, as they had done as young officers and then as senior officers on the battlefield. And the idea that all generals died in bed is a bit of a myth. Not every general that served in the war died, of course, but many of them became casualties, some killed, some wounded, and some taken prisoner. And it's amazing how often we find the graves of these senior officers. And it's something that does surprise the casual visitor and emphasises how important it is to come to these places to see these very things. There are many, many other stories here, and indeed in all three cemeteries. In cemeteries where the vast majority of the dead are identified, we can research these men, we can find out who they were, what they did before the war, what they did in their wartime service, and there are some amazing stories. And we could fill podcast after podcast with some of these, no doubt, but what I like to do is to focus on some that tell some different stories of the Great War. And buried side by side in here are Lieutenant Thomas Lucas and Captain Edward Wixon. They served with the 20th Balloon Company of the Royal Flying Corps and died on the 16th of June 1917. Lucas was the son of Sir Edward Lucas of Newmarket, Cambridgeshire, and Wixon was a Canadian from Toronto who had served in the Boer War with the Canadian contingent. The inscription on his grave reads, "He who dies for others dies a perfect man." They were up at 4,000 feet in an observation balloon, and their balloon, under which was a basket in which they were, with a static telephone line linking them to the ground. They were spotting for the artillery, doing some general observation to see where the German artillery positions perhaps were located or movements on the German front. Their balloon, full of highly explosive gas, came under fire, exploded, and they fell 4,000 feet to their deaths. This was a very dangerous job indeed, working in one of these balloon companies, and they were known within the Flying Corps and the wider army as balloonatics. I met one of these balloonatics at the National Army Museum at a Western Front meeting one time. He'd served as an ordinary aircraftsman with a balloon company and had been involved in aerial observation. He was a signaller, so he'd often gone up with his officer in the basket and operated the telephone to relay his officer's messages back down to the ground. They also took cameras up into the balloons as well and could take panoramic photographs of the battlefield or oblique aerial views of aspects of it, and he had quite a few in his wartime scrapbook. And Lucas and Wixon are two of many balloonatic officers that became casualties undertaking this very vital, this highly important observation reconnaissance role, but one that came at such great risk. Imagine being suspended in one of these baskets underneath this massive balloon, which you knew if it got hit even by tracer bullets from an aircraft, it could just explode in a fireball. And they had parachutes to try and get out. So they had static line parachutes which they could jump over the side of the basket, and the static line of the parachute would pull against it and open the canopy. And sure, it worked quite well, but there were examples. This was early technology, parachute technology, and it didn't always work. Basil Hallam Radford, who was a music hall star before the Great War, was in a balloon company on the Somme, and he jumped from his basket and his parachute didn't open and he fell to his death. But as with Lucas and Wixon, there were many situations in which the officers and the men in the basket just did not have time to jump out and open their parachutes. It was all over, sadly, before they could do anything about it. Both sides used these observation balloons. Both sides understood what their purpose was, what kind of intelligence could be gathered from them. And there they were on a pretty open landscape, up in the air, big balloon. They were an inviting target, and so it's not surprising that casualties in these units could be quite high. So leaving thoughts of the balloonatics behind us, we'll go back out the entrance, turn right up towards the modern fast road that runs between Poperinghe and Ypres. There's traffic lights on this particular junction and a way you can walk across and cross to the old railway line, or the route of the old railway line. It's a modern railway line now that still runs between Poperinghe and Ypres, and in previous episodes I've very much recommended taking that journey at some point. You'll go past the cemeteries here at Brandhoek and see them from the train, and it's a really nice thing to do, and it gives you I think a greater appreciation and understanding of the landscape as well, and how all of this fits in. but we'll cross over that railway line, go up to the old road that ran between Poperinghe and Ypres, and then we'll turn right and walk down to the modern church of Brandhoek. The village has expanded since the end of the Great War as this landscape was rebuilt, and there are a lot more modern houses on this road. And outside the church in Brandhoek is a new memorial to Chavasse, to Noel Chavasse, that commemorates him. And this was part of a project in the 1990s in Flanders to commemorate some of the key individuals connected with different parts of Flanders fields and explain what their story was. So it's quite a nice memorial with a glass panel with a depiction of Chavasse on it. It's not a specific location where he was, but it's close obviously to the cemetery and the casualty clearing station where he died. Chavasse, one of so many names in these three cemeteries that we've visited, so many stories we could tell. The beauty of walking round these silent cities where we discover they're not so silent at all, that they have so much to tell us. They are time capsules of the Great War that tell so many stories, so many angles of what that conflict was all about. And whenever I come here and I look down the old road, and modern traffic thunders along it, people cycle down there on their bike, but once, back then, it was a cobbled road that echoed to the boots of British soldiers, the studs on their boots striking the cobbles, and this strange echoey noise as men marched along these roads to and from the front. There are many, many memoirs of soldiers that recount walking down this road, and some of the veterans that I interviewed, men like Albert Bamfield, who marched down here with his fellow signallers, including his brother Marcus, in the 13th Battalion Royal Sussex Regiment, moving up to take part in the 3rd Battle of Ypres. I think of them, and I think of what this road meant to them. They were heading up the line to an uncertain future, and at that point they were in trepidation. And then days later, if they'd survived, they were marching back, and ahead of them they knew was relief. It was time off from the line, rest and recuperation, then a camp, perhaps a trip to a local estaminet, dance with a girl, play on a piano, drink some beer. Lighter moments of the war that they never forgot and meant a lot to them. The war wasn't just about the front line. These areas behind the lines were just as important, and we shall continue to visit many of them on these journeys across the battlefields. But today, soldiers no longer march along this road. In normal times, cars and coaches take the new visitors to the battlefields. This today is a new arterial route, taking people for different reasons to remember and understand, a road that takes them onwards, ever onwards, to the old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.